Communism is the doctrine of the conditions of the liberation of the proletariat. Wow, what a great way to start off our work. And not just any work, but a Marxist work. Just take stock that we will rarely have or see one-sentence paragraphs, much like the predecessors before Marx and Engels, like Hegel and company. Anyways, once we deal with paragraphs like these, we want to take the utmost effort to carefully analyze the sections. So, shall we? Rereading this section again, communism is the doctrine of the conditions of the liberation of the proletariat. What Engels stated here was a universal. Now what the hell is a universal? And why so early in the work? Well, two equally great questions, and let me explain right now. A universal, simply stated, is what it is and what it is not. To elaborate on this matter, it contains a wide array of particulars that makes it the universal up, but the particulars themselves don't have to be in agreement with each other, and thusly they actively oppose each other. Now what the hell does that all mean? Well, to make an example out of this, let's analyze a random chalk. Let's just say for now this chalk contains key universal traits of whiteness, dryness, and a cylindrical shape, which these all together can be found in any other chalks, and more importantly, these all individually can be found in other things that aren't a chalk. So what makes this chalk unique not only to itself, but to all non-chalks as well? It makes it unique that despite sharing these very clear universal traits amongst all of them that could possess them, since there's two defining features that help separate them all from each other, how the traits actively oppose one another in the chalk, and the contingencies that makes it up. The latter, contingency, is easy to explain. It means accidents. Of course, it is not to say that some of these accidents are done on purpose, but that all accidents are clear events that help determine things. Now the former, opposition, or more clearly, opposition in the active sense. From the active sense, we see that clearly things that oppose each other don't simply cancel each other out. That's really a passive way to describe opposition and opposing something, but rather, described in a physical sense, push each other out, like they push each other out. Where instead of one thing shining above the others, it instead helps us to see each individual universal trait stand out and in fact help strengthen each universal trait. Now let's derail back to the second question that asks about why Engels even lays down the definition so early on. I like to veer away from the term definition for now, of course. What Engels lays down here is the foundations of the universality of communism, and his reasons for doing so is A, to later explain the universal traits of communism, and B, when the universality of communism, and thusly the particulars of such, cannot be. Key emphasis on cannot be, mind you, but that'll be later on. And well, instead of really answering these right now, here and now, I'm going to let Engels give us the information later, so then you can see why these matter, and more importantly, be able to understand what Engels is saying here in this very first section. Now, this work doesn't seem as innocent as you thought it was. Thankfully, it just gets better from here, but whatever attitude you had before, and mainly it's the innocence attitude, it needs to be dropped when reading Engels and later Marx, because one must carefully and correctly read them in order to understand what they are saying in the first place and what they're implicating as well, especially when they get on the topic of universality and particularity of any universals they may be describing. But more upon the universal and particular talk later. The proletariat is that class of society which lives entirely from the sale of its labor and does not draw profit from any kind of capital, whose weal and woe, whose life and death, whose sole existence depends on the demand for labor, hence on the changing state of business, on the vagaries of unbridled competition. The proletariat, or the class of proletarians, is, in a word, the working class of the 19th century. Well, yet again, another talk of the universalities we have here, but this particular universality is actually a universal trait, going back to section 1, and most importantly, it makes our abstract foundation, from section 1, mind you, more concrete. Now, Engels and equally Marxist abstractions are what we say are material abstractions. Know for now that they aren't based upon whimsical idealism or philosophical thought, but upon material reality. Now we say concrete instead of clear, because the latter, clear, is already been achieved in the abstract foundations. I mean, just reread the section 1. It's right there. It's clear. It states the communist project. Yet, in the former, the concrete, it's a clear dialectical stage. I will precariously say that it's a dialectically positive stage and not a negative stage. No, the difference right now is that a negative stage is one that requires a negation to happen, or something to negate the other, and a positive stage is a reproduction of a thing or situation under new conditions. Regardless, both make concrete of an abstract, since now we get new things to consider, and we can craft new doctrines to deal with the new conditions. Getting back on universal traits and whatnot, it's displayed here the predicates and contingencies of a proletariat in this section. The contingent elements are the existence of capital, which will be explained later, and the existence of capital in our modern contemporary society, and more importantly, the society that Engels was living in. The predicates revolve around this contingency, capital, and its existence, which implicates the following: that the pro cannot and doesn't have the option to utilize capital to better themselves. If they did, they would be a petty bourgeois person, which, although they still have to labor, can rely upon capital to better themselves and are able to generate capital for themselves. If a petty bourgeois person is continuing down the bourgeois path, they'll eventually become the bourgeoisie, or a part of the bourgeoisie. Getting back on the proletariat, not being able to utilize capital means that they have to sell their labor power in order to acquire what they need for their survival. In this universality of a proletariat, since they depend upon the market to have the demand for their own labor power, and the fact that they cannot utilize capital as a means of subsistence, it really puts the proletariat as the working class. And I'm talking about the universal proletariat right now. Now, note that despite being a universal, the universal proletariat, the universality of communism, those aren't excluded from the dialectic. They aren't allowed to be in a metaphysical bubble, in a metaphysical vacuum. Now, the dialectic I'm talking about is the dialectic of the march of history in this case. And nonetheless, that the universal proletariat dynamically will have a particular of its own in each area of the world. Now, what is the march of history? For now, accept this definition of the march of history, then the march of history is a constant, non-linear, and helical march of history towards an end, or the end of history, really. More concretely, think of a single helix and a double helix. That can easily be described of any dialectic that we can think of, funnily enough. Getting back on the topic of dynamicism, I say dynamic since anything cannot be analyzed in a vacuum and nothing will be one-to-one to its closest brethren and sisters. Not even a twin, not even a Siamese twin, really is their twin. I mean, if they were, it would just be a superposition at that point. Why to call them two separate things? They're just exactly the same thing. Now, why am I allowed to say that A doesn't really necessarily equal A when, even though we know that A really isn't A? Because one of them, it literally isn't in the same place in the other. This one key thing that we talked about earlier, in the first section even, contingency. Contingencies play a huge role, no matter where you are, within Marxist, Hegelian, any dialectical philosophy or ideology. Contingencies play a huge role, no matter where you are, but more upon that later. To go back upon the subject of vacuums, once you analyze one thing in a metaphysical isolation, you'll slowly come to realize that you'll just be starting to bring everything else in, and it'll just collapse the vacuum. This was described in Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. It's going to be carried over with Marx and Engels. I mean, after all, they were young Hegelians to begin with. But let's close the remarks in this section. The universal proletariat of the 19th century will not be the same as the universal proletariat of the now, the 21st century. Clearly, we can just easily chalk it up to contingencies of what happened between the 19th century and the 21st century, but also upon the fact that the communist projects have made concrete this abstraction of the universal proletariat. Not only did they made it more concrete, what I'm trying to say here right now is perfect this abstraction, but they also make it impossible to really rely upon the 19th century universal proletariat as a model of what we should look at for all the proletariats that we have nowadays. That's why our proletariat, our universal proletariat of the now, the 21st century, needs to be carefully analyzed in order to understand every particular and particularity of this universal proletariat. Because if we can't understand the universal proletariat today, we certainly don't understand a proletariat now, and more importantly, we wouldn't even dare to understand a proletariat all those yesteryears, all those years ago, all those centuries ago. Again, to go back upon closing remarks of a previous section, there is no such thing as having an innocent attitude when analyzing anybody, really. No, there have always been poor and working classes, and the working class have mostly been poor. But there have not always been workers and poor people living under conditions as they are today. In other words, there have not always been proletarians, any more than there has always been free, unbridled competitions. Now, this passage is as straightforward can be. Really, it just makes concrete the distinction of the previous conditions of non-proletariat workers, that being workers of a different social order, workers that weren't in the capitalist social order, but also makes concrete the conditions of also the proletarian workers, workers that were in a capitalist social order. But as I said again, we shall see Engels talking way more about this, and I'll analyze each time Engels mentioned particularly the conditions and also the traits of non-proletarian and proletarian workers carefully, mind you. Regardless, to go back upon making concrete of a distinction, it in fact makes concrete of another universality, going back to section 1, that universality being the universal trait of conditions. In fact, it makes it so concrete that really the existence and success of capitalism in the world is required for communism to come to be. Take stock of that. For as we shall see later, the communist doctrine, through universal consideration of everything, in itself really seeks to abolish, and I do not mean in the annihilation sense, but I mean in the superseding sense, mind you, when I'm talking about abolish, and whenever you hear a Marxist talking about abolishing capitalism, they're really saying superseding capitalism, to supersede capitalism, to overcome capitalism, to overcome everything that is wrong with capitalism, and to bring about society that doesn't have the ills of capitalism, but is more than capitalism than we currently have. Yet the communist doctrine for itself will have to be a particular whenever an area, region, state, province, or a country is taken into heavy consideration and applied in a manner that respects the very real conditions, the very material conditions of that area. No matter what. Just look at Mao's China. Look at Lenin's CCCP. Christ, even look at Stalin's CCCP. They looked at the very contingencies that was plaguing each country. They built a doctrine upon those, regardless of how bad or good the contingencies were, and how it worked out, regardless of the fact if the people that superseded them later on was carrying out the communist project. Each communist doctrine is going to be a particular for an area no matter what, even though its universal goal in itself is to abolish the very conditions that suppress the working class, the proletariat, and also equally to abolish capitalism. But let's get back on topic. With all, as we shall see later in the work, the advent of capitalism can only bring about the conditions of this very proletarian class that we know of today, that Engels knew of back then in the 19th century. For if capitalism developed in any other way, we would have a totally different proletariat to tend with entirely. Thus again, we must take the dialectic, that being the march of history in this case, into heavy consideration when analyzing anything that has a living material origin. For the proletariat in the capitalist social order abolished, again superseded, a previous working class in the feudal epoch, denoted now by me as the mercantilist era, and in the mercantilist era, the working classes were mainly composed of handicraftsmen and manufacture workers. And as we shall see later, these distinctions are very important later on in the work and should be important to take stock of even today. Again, Engels and every communist are and ought to be a dialectician and not a metaphysician, as clearly stated in the previous two sections. And even in this section, as we see here, the dialectic is at work with the very theory that Engels is going to lay down with Marx, with Lenin, with Stalin, with Mao, and every other dialectician that respects these figures, a very clear theory, a universal theory for their cases, mind you, but a very clear theory to help the working class to abolish capitalism, But not only do we see them using the dialectic at hand to craft a good theory, a theory that respects the time and the area, but also we see them showcase the theory of logic at hand as well. For the dialectics is a theory of logic, how one comprehends the world as is, as was, as it shall be, but also see how the as was is connected with the as is, and how the as is connected with the as it shall be in the future, or as it might be in the future. The latter case being way more strengthened and should be taken way more into consideration than what ought to be. And it's very clear that these dialecticians use this very theory of logic, whether they like it or not. Because if you agree with dialectical philosophy, you're going to have to use this very theory of logic, dialectics, to not only understand what they were analyzing and what they could have analyzed, but to also agree with their points and to see the world as is, as was, and as it might be in the future. But more upon that theory of logic later down the road in this channel, and also later down the road in this work as well.